The San Luis Valley of Colorado was a land of jagged peaks and endless, unforgiving sky. In the burning summer of 1888, the heat shimmered off the sagebrush like a restless ghost. Sarah stood on her porch and shielded her eyes from the blinding glare. She wore a simple blue dress, faded by the sun and frequent washing. A red headscarf was tied tightly to keep the relentless dust from her hair. Around her neck hung a small gold heart, its surface scratched but still shining. It was the last thing her husband, James, had given her before the Great Blizzard. The winter of 1886 and 1887 had changed everything for the ranchers of the American West. History books would call it the Big Die-Up. To Sarah, it was simply the end of her world. The cold had fallen so low that men spoke of 60 below in terrified whispers. Thousands of cattle had frozen where they stood, piled against the fence lines in horrific mounds. James had been one of the brave men who rode out into the white madness. He never came back. Now, 2 years later, the Emerald Creek Ranch was a hollow shell of its former glory. The windmill groaned in the light breeze, a rhythmic cry for oil and care. The barn doors sagged on rusted hinges. The cattle were fewer, but the land remained vast and demanding. It was 5,000 acres of emerald grass and desperate hope. But it was far too much for one woman to hold alone. If she lost Emerald Creek, she wouldn't just lose her ranch. She would lose the last promise she had made to her husband. Sarah heard a steady rhythm of hooves on the parched earth. A lone rider was approaching from the south trail. Sarah instinctively held her breath. Every stranger could bring hope, or the end of everything she still owned. He wasn't a local man from the valley. He rode a sturdy bay horse with a weary, heavy-headed gait. The stranger wore a wide-brimmed hat, salt-stained and weathered. A heavy leather vest sat over a tan shirt caked in the dust of long miles. He looked like a man who had ridden through 3 states with nothing but dust, hunger, and silence for company. He stopped at the edge of the yard, maintaining a respectful distance. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't shout a greeting. He just sat there, looking at the house with eyes that had seen too much. Sarah stepped down from the porch, her hand instinctively touching the gold heart at her throat. "Can I help you, stranger?" she asked. Her voice was steady, despite the sudden fluttering in her chest. The man tipped his hat with a slow, deliberate grace. His eyes were the color of the Sangre de Cristo mountains after a heavy rainstorm. "Name is Caleb Thorne, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I heard in town you might be looking for a hand." Sarah looked at his hands. They were calloused, scarred, and stained by honest labor. They were the hands of a man who knew the language of the earth. "I can't pay much, Mr. Thorne," she warned him. "I'm barely keeping the taxes paid." "I'm more interested in a solid roof and a steady meal," Caleb replied. He looked past her at the sprawling golden horizon. "You've got a lot of beautiful land here, Mrs. Sterling." Sarah nodded, a bitterness creeping into her tone. Too much, according to the bank and the buzzards in town. She led him toward the barn. The smell of dry hay and old oiled leather greeted them. She showed him the empty horse stalls and the small, cramped room in the loft. Caleb didn't complain about the thick dust or the lack of light. He didn't ask for a soft bed or a fireplace. He simply set his worn saddle down and started to work. By the next morning, the windmill had stopped its mournful groaning. Caleb had climbed the tower and greased the gears before the sun touched the peaks. Sarah watched him from the kitchen window as she brewed bitter coffee. She felt a strange, terrifying warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the rising summer heat. It was the quiet comfort of not being the only person breathing in the silence. Over the next month, Caleb became a quiet shadow on the ranch. He fixed the fences that the brutal winter had torn down. He never talked about where he came from or why he was running. But he listened with deep intensity when Sarah talked about James. Some evenings, Sarah spoke about James. Caleb never interrupted. He simply listened. Somehow that quiet kindness eased a grief she had carried alone for 2 long years. One evening, they sat on the porch as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was a bruised masterpiece of purple, gold, and violent orange. "The grass is coming back well this year," Caleb said. He was leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the grazing herd. "It's good land, Sarah." She liked the way he said her name, soft and lingering. It sounded like a quiet prayer in the middle of a storm. Caleb caught himself smiling whenever Sarah laughed. It had been years since another person's happiness had mattered to him. "The bank doesn't care about the grass," she sighed, clutching her ledger. "They only care about the deed and the interest rates." Thomas Miller, the town's wealthiest land developer, had been visiting far too often. Years earlier, James Sterling had once refused to sell him even a single acre. Miller had never forgotten the humiliation. He was a man who saw gold where others saw soul. He wanted to turn Emerald Creek into a massive shipping hub for the new railroad. A few days later, Miller arrived in his polished black carriage. He stepped out, carefully dusting off his expensive charcoal suit. "Mrs. Sterling," he said with an oily, practiced smile, "I hope you've reconsidered my very generous offer." Sarah stood her ground, her spine as straight as a rifle barrel. "The answer is still no, Thomas." Miller glanced at Caleb, who was sharpening a heavy axe nearby. "I see you've hired some wandering help," Miller sneered. "A drifter won't save this place from the inevitable, Sarah. It's a heavy responsibility for a woman of your standing to carry. Think of your reputation in this community." Caleb stopped sharpening the axe. The harsh sound of the stone against metal died away instantly. He didn't say a single word, but his gaze was like a loaded Winchester aimed directly at Miller's heart. Miller cleared his throat nervously and retreated to his carriage. 30 days, Sarah," he called out as the horses lurched forward. "The debt is due, and the bank does not accept excuses." That night, the air was thick and heavy with the scent of rain that wouldn't fall. Sarah couldn't sleep. She went out to the porch to breathe the cool, high-altitude air. The stars were unbelievably bright. They looked like tiny holes in a black velvet curtain. She found Caleb sitting on the top step, silhouetted by the moon. "He's right about one thing," Caleb said quietly into the dark. "What's that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Your ranch is too big." Sarah felt a sudden, sharp pang of disappointment in her gut. She thought he was going to tell her to pack her bags and give up. "It's too big for one man and one woman to fight the whole world," he continued. "But it's just the right size for a home." He stood up and looked directly at her. The lantern light caught the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes. "I lost a place once," Caleb confessed, his voice cracking. "In the Great Fire of '71 back in Chicago. I lost every single thing I had ever built with my own hands. I've been running from that emptiness ever since." Sarah reached out and touched his rough sleeve. "Maybe you don't have to run anymore, Caleb. If Sarah and Caleb's quiet bond has touched your heart, please stay with us. Their hardest choice is still ahead." The next week brought a different, more insidious kind of trouble. The ladies of the local church society paid a formal, unsolicited visit. They didn't come with warm pies or sisterly well wishes. They came with sharp tongues and judgmental hearts. Mrs. Higgins, the preacher's wife, stood at the front of the group. "Sarah, dear," she began, her nose tilted toward the sky. "I know what it's like to lose a husband," Mrs. Higgins said quietly. "That is why I'm afraid for you. People in town are talking. A lone woman and a man who isn't her kin or her husband. It simply isn't proper." Sarah felt the hot blood rush to her face. "He is my employee, Mrs. Higgins, and he is a man of honor, which is more than I can say for some." "Honor doesn't pay the bills of morality," the woman snapped back. "You are a widow. You should be in town under the protection of a proper community, not out here in the wilderness with a complete stranger." Sarah looked at the circle of women. She saw the hollow pity and the sharp edges of their judgment. She thought of all the long, freezing nights she had cried alone. She thought of the frozen cattle and the empty chair that haunted her table. None of these women had offered her a hand when the snow was 10 feet deep. "If my reputation is the price of my home," Sarah said firmly, "then it is a price I am more than willing to pay. Good day, ladies." She slammed the heavy oak door and leaned her weight against it. She was shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Caleb was standing in the shadows of the hallway. He had heard every cruel word. "I should go," he said, his eyes downcast. "I'm causing you more grief than help." "No," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare leave." She walked right up to him, defying the space between them. "They don't know what it's like out here. They don't know the terrifying silence of this valley." She took a deep, shaky breath. "Stay, Caleb." The final 30 days were a whirlwind of salt, sweat, and grit. Caleb and Sarah worked from the first light of dawn until the moon rose high. They moved the remaining herd to the high, nutrient-rich pastures. They reinforced the barn doors against the coming autumn gales. But despite their labor, the ledger remained a cruel master. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the cold, hard numbers. She was $500 short of the final bank payment. In 1888, that was a small fortune, an impossible mountain to climb. She looked at the gold heart necklace resting in her palm. It was worth a few dollars, but not nearly enough to save the soil. Caleb came in, wiping grease and sweat from his tanned forehead. "I have an idea," he said, though his eyes looked pained. "There's a major horse auction in Del Norte next Tuesday. If we sell the bay and the 2 young colts, we might just make it." "The bay is your horse, Caleb," Sarah said, her heart aching. "It's the only thing in this world you truly own." "I own my hands," he said simply, his voice devoid of regret. "And I own my word to you." They traveled the long road to Del Norte in the ranch wagon. The town was bustling with desperate miners and wealthy cattlemen. The air smelled of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and nervous excitement. Sarah watched with a lump in her throat as Caleb led his horse into the ring. The bay was a fine, loyal animal with a coat like polished mahogany. The bidding was slow and agonizing at first. Then, a familiar, arrogant voice rang out from the crowd. $100. It was Thomas Miller. He was smiling, savoring the sight of Sarah's public desperation. $150, a local rancher called out. $200, Miller countered immediately. He didn't actually want the horse. He wanted to humiliate them until they broke. Caleb stood in the center of the dusty ring, his face like carved stone. Sarah felt a sob rising in her chest. She realized then that Caleb wasn't just trying to save the ranch. He was trying to save her soul from the darkness. The bidding climbed steadily to $400. Miller finally stopped, realizing he was paying triple the horse's value. The heavy wooden hammer fell with a sound like a gunshot. Caleb walked over to Sarah and handed her the thick stack of bills. "It's still not enough," she whispered, her hands shaking. "We are still $100 short." Caleb reached deep into his leather vest pocket. He pulled out a heavy, tarnished silver pocket watch. "This was my father's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a fine Waltham watch, the best thing my father ever owned." He walked to the local jeweler while Sarah waited in the wagon. He came back 10 minutes later with the remaining $100. He had absolutely nothing left now. No horse. No family legacy. No past to return to. They rode back to the ranch in a heavy, pregnant silence. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks, painting the world in blood. Sarah reached over and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. It was the first time they had truly touched as more than workers. His grip was strong, warm, and desperate. The next morning, Sarah rode into town alone, her jaw set. She walked into the bank and placed the money on the mahogany desk. Thomas Miller was there, lurking near the teller's cage. His face turned a sickly pale gray when he saw the cold cash. "Every cent," Sarah said, her voice ringing through the lobby. "With interest." She waited with a pounding heart for the official receipt. She watched the clerk stamp the deed with "paid in full" in bright red ink. She walked out of that bank with her head held higher than the mountains.
She didn't look at Miller's crumbling face. She didn't look at the judgmental ladies whispering on the sidewalk. She rode back to Emerald Creek as fast as the horses would pull. When she arrived, Caleb was standing by the empty corral. He was leaning on the fence, staring at the space where his horse should be. Sarah climbed down from the wagon and ran to him, the paper fluttering. "It's ours," she cried, the tears finally flowing freely. "The ranch is safe." Caleb smiled, but it was a weary, heartbreakingly sad smile. "I'm glad, Sarah. You deserve to keep this piece of heaven." He started walking toward the barn to pack his meager bag. "Where are you going?" she asked, her heart sinking like a stone. Caleb stopped, his back to her.
"I told you before," he said softly. "Your ranch is too big. It's too big for a man with no horse, no money, and no future. I've done what I came here to do. I'll head over the pass toward New Mexico tomorrow. Maybe there's work for a broken man in the silver mines." Sarah felt a hot tear track through the dust on her cheek. She looked at the barn, the spinning windmill, and the golden cattle. The ranch was beautiful, but it suddenly felt cold and empty again. The silence was returning to swallow her whole. She walked up to him and stood on the lowest porch step. She was at his eye level now, staring into his battered soul. The scene was like a painting of the old, vanishing West. Late afternoon sunlight wrapped them in warm amber light. The barn stood strong and silent in the background. The windmill turned slowly, acting as the heartbeat for the land. "Your ranch is too big," Caleb repeated, his voice breaking. He looked at the dusty, lonely trail he was about to walk. Sarah reached out and took his worn collar in both hands. She pulled him just an inch closer into her space. Tears blurred her vision. She had buried one man she loved. She could not bear to watch another one disappear down the same lonely trail. "Then stay here," she whispered against the wind. "Stay here, with me." Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. He looked into her eyes and saw the raw, naked truth. She wasn't asking for a hired hand to fix her fences. She wasn't asking for a protector to hide behind. She was asking for a partner to walk beside. "I have nothing left to give you, Sarah," he said, his voice a ghost of a sound. "You gave me the sunrise when I thought the night would never end," she replied. "You gave me a reason to look at the horizon and not fear it." Caleb reached up and touched the edge of her red scarf. He gently tucked a stray blonde hair behind her sun-reddened ear. "The winter will be hard, Sarah," he warned, thinking of the white death of '86. "We will face the frost together," she said, her voice a vow. He dropped his canvas bag onto the weathered porch boards. The heavy thud was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. He took her in his strong arms and pulled her against his chest. The smell of cedar, tobacco, and hard work surrounded her. They stood there for a very long time, two shadows becoming one. Neither of them said another word. Some promises were too sacred for words. Two souls who had been broken into pieces by the cruel West. Two people who decided to build something immortal from the ruins. In the distance, a young calf lowed for its mother. The Emerald Creek Ranch wasn't just a business or a piece of dirt anymore. It was a living legacy of resilience. The town gossip didn't stop, of course. If anything, the whispers grew louder and more frequent. But Sarah and Caleb didn't care for the opinions of small minds. They were married in the small, quiet parlor of the ranch house. The jeweler who had bought the Waltham watch came as the witness. He brought the watch back as his own wedding gift to the couple. A man who sells his history to save a woman's future deserves to keep time, he said. They expanded the herd through the changing years. They survived the brutal drought of 1890 that broke so many others. And they never forgot that golden afternoon on the porch. The ranch was indeed very big, but their love for the land and each other was bigger. Every evening they would sit in that same spot on the steps, The red scarf would flutter like a flag in the mountain wind, and they would look out at the emerald land they had fought to save. It was a land of jagged peaks and an endless, beautiful sky. But now, finally, it was a land called home. Thank you for staying until the very end of this long journey. Sarah and Caleb's story reminds us that we are never truly lost. Even in the toughest times, we find our strength through sacrifice. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves the grit and glory of our Great West. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next frontier adventure. Next time, we will explore the mysterious story of a hidden letter. It was found in a pioneer's trunk and changed a family's destiny forever. You won't want to miss the secret of the willow tree. Keep the fire burning in your heart and keep riding toward the light.